The air inside the cabin was a familiar recycled breath. It was the kind of air that tasted of stale coffee and faint, sweet perfume, a scent that spoke of long journeys and the shared, temporary space of strangers. At 35,000 feet, the world outside was a masterpiece of blue and white, a serene canvas far removed from the worries on the ground. Inside, a gentle hum vibrated through the floor, a constant, reassuring song from the massive engines that carried the metal tube and its 200 souls through the sky. For most, it was the soundtrack to boredom or sleep, but for the woman sitting by the window in seat 23A, it was a language she used to speak fluently. She was no longer a pilot. That life was a world away, replaced by spreadsheets, software code, and the quiet hum of a computer server room. She was a consultant now, her days filled with logical problems and digital solutions. Yet the old instincts never truly faded. They lay dormant, like muscles' memory, waiting to be awakened. She sipped her lukewarm tea, her eyes not on the movie screen flickering in the darkened cabin, but on the subtle dance of the wing against the endless sky. She noticed the slight, almost imperceptible flex of the metal as the plane nudged through a pocket of turbulence. She felt the minute change in pressure against her eardrums before the captain even thought about turning on the seatbelt sign. These were the small details her former self lived for, the tiny whispers of the machine that told a story most people never heard. The flight was routine, the very definition of uneventful. A flight attendant with a tired but warm smile moved down the aisle, offering small bags of pretzels and cans of soda. A young couple a few rows ahead whispered and laughed, sharing a pair of earbuds. An elderly man read a newspaper, his glasses perched low on his nose. It was a perfect snapshot of modern travel, a bubble of mundane normality suspended miles above the earth. The woman leaned her head against the cool plastic of the window, letting the drone of the engines lull her into a state of quiet contemplation. She thought about the project she was heading to London for, a complex system integration that would challenge her mind in a different way than pulling a fighter jet out of a high-G turn. It was a good life, a safe life, but sometimes she missed the raw, untamed power of it, the feeling of being on the very edge of control. That's when she first heard it. It wasn't a loud noise, nothing that would draw the attention of anyone else. It was a change in the engine song. The deep, steady hum had a slight flutter to it, a fractional hesitation that was out of place. It was the kind of sound a pilot might make a note of to have the mechanics check on landing, a minor anomaly in an otherwise perfect performance. She dismissed it at first, chalking it up to her own oversensitive hearing, a ghost from her past. But then she felt it. The plane, which had been flying perfectly level, made a very slight, almost unnoticeable bank to the left. It was corrected instantly, but the correction was clumsy, not the smooth, automated adjustment she was used to. It felt human. And it felt wrong. Her senses, now on high alert, began to scan the cabin. Her eyes moved past the dozing passengers and the glowing screens, searching for the source of this subtle wrongness. She saw them then. Two men, standing near the rear exit doors. They weren't talking to each other. They weren't looking at their phones. They were just standing, their bodies unnaturally still, their eyes fixed forward. One of them, a tall man with a thick neck, kept wiping his sweating palms on his jeans. The other, shorter and wiry, kept glancing at his watch, his jaw tight. They didn't look like they were waiting for the lavatory. They looked like they were waiting for a signal. A cold knot began to form in the woman's stomach. This wasn't a mechanical problem. This was something else entirely. She watched as a third man emerged from the first-class lavatory, moving with a jerky, nervous energy. He was holding something in his hand, something wrapped in a dark cloth, but the shape was unmistakable. It was heavy, and he held it like a weapon. The three men now made eye contact, a silent, grim exchange that sealed a terrible pact. The calm bubble of the flight had just been pierced, and a silent, creeping dread began to seep into the cabin. A few other passengers had noticed them now, a frown here, a questioning glance there. The low murmur of conversation quieted, replaced by a nervous, collective intake of breath. The lead hijacker, the one who had come from the lavatory, started moving toward the front of the plane. The other two followed, fanning out to block the aisles. Their movements were aggressive, filled with a brittle confidence that barely masked their fear. They weren't professionals. The woman could see that immediately. Their steps were too heavy, their postures too tense. They were amateurs, which in many ways was far more frightening. A professional is predictable. An amateur is capable of anything. The cabin was now silent. The only sounds the frantic beating of 200 hearts and the ever-present hum of the engines. The flight attendant who had been serving drinks froze in the middle of the aisle, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrific understanding. The lead hijacker reached the cockpit door. He didn't knock. He banged on it with his fist, a loud, violent thud that echoed through the tense silence. "Open up," he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and authority. A moment later, the captain's voice came over the public address system, but it was different now. The calm, professional tone was strained, tight with a tension that everyone could feel. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing a minor security situation. Please remain calm." But his words did little to calm anyone. How could they be calm when they could see the man with the makeshift weapon pounding on the door that protected their lives? There was another sound, a muffled shout from inside the cockpit, and then a sickening thud like a heavy weight falling against a wall. The passengers watched in frozen horror as the cockpit door swung open. The captain and the first officer were shoved out into the cabin, their hands raised in surrender. Their faces were pale, their eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and defeat. They had done their best, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. "Outside," the lead hijacker grunted, gesturing with his weapon not towards the cabin, but towards the main door at the front of the plane. Now, it was a nonsensical, terrifying order. The pilots, the only two people on board who could safely fly this massive machine, were being forced away from the controls. They were pushed to the floor near the galley, hostages in their own aircraft. And then the ultimate horror. The hijacker stepped into the cockpit and slammed the door, leaving the flight deck and the fate of everyone on board terrifyingly unattended. For a few heart-stopping seconds, the plane flew on, a ghost ship in the sky, with no one at the helm. The silence that followed the slam of the cockpit door was heavier than sound. It was a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered the cabin, pressing down on every single person. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the entire plane, all 200 tons of it, was holding its breath along with its passengers. Then a wave of sound broke over them, a collective gasp. A choked sob from the back, the sharp, terrified cry of a child who didn't understand the silence but felt the fear of her mother. The spell was broken, and panic, raw and primal, began to ripple through the aisles. People looked at each other, their eyes wide with a question no one could answer. What now? The two pilots, the symbols of authority and safety, were on the floor, their faces ashen. They were just men now, as helpless as everyone else. The hijackers, the three men who had shattered their world, were trying to establish a new order, but their authority was built on a shaky foundation of fear and desperation, and it was already starting to crack. The lead hijacker, the one who had shoved his way into the cockpit, was gone. The two left behind were like nervous dogs, all bark and no bite, their aggression a thin mask for their own terror. But for the woman in seat 23A, something strange was happening. While the fear was a cold, physical presence in her stomach, a sharp, clear thought cut through it like a knife. It was a feeling she remembered from her old life, the moment just before a critical maneuver in a storm or a complex test flight. It was the feeling of her mind sharpening, the world slowing down, every detail coming into razor-sharp focus. The panic that was infecting the cabin seemed to bounce off her, unable to find a place to land. She wasn't feeling brave. She was feeling analytical. Her training, buried under years of software and spreadsheets, was rising to the surface, a life raft in a sea of chaos. She began to take in the scene with the cold, detached eye of an engineer assessing a problem. There were three hostiles. One was in the cockpit, a place he almost certainly didn't belong. She was willing to bet her life he couldn't fly this plane. The sophisticated avionics, the complex systems, the sheer physics of it all, it took years of training to master. This man was a thug with a weapon, not a pilot. That was her first piece of data, and it was the most important one. The other two were in the cabin. The tall one was standing near the front trying to look menacing, but his eyes kept darting towards the cockpit door, as if afraid his leader might fail. The shorter one was pacing in the middle aisle, shouting at people to put their hands on their heads. His voice was loud, but it shook, and every time a passenger moved too quickly, he flinched. They were amateurs. This was her second piece of data. Amateurs make mistakes. Her eyes scanned the rest of the environment. The plane was still flying, but the flight path felt wrong. There was a slight, uncorrected drift. The autopilot was likely still engaged, but it was clear someone had been fiddling with the controls. She felt a gentle, persistent vibration that wasn't from the engines. It was the shudder of the airframe, a sign of stress. These men were a danger not just because of their weapons, but because of their incompetence. They were a threat to the aircraft itself. Her mind started to run through a mental checklist, just like she used to do before a flight. What are my assets? What are the threats? What is the objective? The assets were scattered and terrified. The two pilots on the floor were a potential resource, but they were guarded. The cabin crew were trained for emergencies, but not for this. They were trying to calm passengers, their faces pale, but their voices steady. One of them, a woman with a kind face and a firm voice, was moving slowly down the aisle, whispering reassurances. She was a flicker of professionalism in the darkness. The threats were the three men and their unknown plan. And the objective, the only objective that mattered, was to regain control of the flight deck before one of these fools sent them all spiraling into the ocean. The lead hijacker's voice suddenly blared over the public address system, distorted and full of static. Nobody move. Nobody talk. We are in control now. His voice was too loud, grating on the nerves. He was trying to sound powerful, but he just sounded scared. The shorter hijacker in the cabin seemed emboldened by his leader's voice. He grabbed a laptop from a man's tray table and threw it to the floor, where it shattered with a sickening crack. I said heads down. He screamed. The act was pointless, a display of brute force that did nothing to further his goal and everything to increase the tension. It was another mistake. It was then that the flight attendant, the one with the kind face, moved past the woman's row. Their eyes met for just a second. In that brief glance, a universe of communication passed between them. The flight attendant's eyes were pleading, a silent cry for help. But there was something else there, to a flicker of recognition. She had seen the woman watching, analyzing. She knew she wasn't just another terrified passenger. The woman gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a promise. It was an acknowledgement. I see you. I understand. The flight attendant gave an equally subtle gesture with her hand, a small palm-down motion that said, "Wait, be calm." She was trying to manage the situation, to prevent a stampede, to give them all time. She was an ally, whether she knew it or not. The woman's gaze fell back to the two hijackers in the cabin. They were focused on the passengers, on maintaining their illusion of control. Their attention was not on the individual, but on the crowd. They were looking for big movements, for defiance. They weren't looking for quiet, small, calculated actions. Her mind raced, the calculus of fear playing out in a series of rapid-fire calculations. The odds were terrible. The risk was absolute. But the alternative, doing nothing, letting these men fly the plane into a mountain or a city, was unthinkable. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her gut, but it was no longer in control. It had become a tool, a source of adrenaline, a sharpening stone for her senses. She knew what she had to do. It was a crazy, suicidal plan, but it was the only one they had. She took a slow, quiet breath, and with a deliberate, silent motion, she reached down and unfastened her seatbelt. The soft click of the metal buckle releasing was the loudest sound in her world. The soft click of the metal buckle releasing was a sound that seemed to echo in the woman's mind. A tiny, defiant chime against the roar of the engines and the pounding of her own heart. It was the first physical action she had taken, a commitment to a path that could only end one of two ways. She remained perfectly still, her hands resting on her knees, her body language a mask of calm compliance. But inside, her mind was a whirlwind of activity, a high-speed processor running through every possible scenario and discarding them one by one. A direct assault was suicide. The two men in the cabin were nervous, which made them dangerous. A sudden move from her would likely be met with a panicked, indiscriminate reaction. They might shoot into the crowd, they might detonate whatever explosive they might have. The risk was too high. Waiting was not an option either. Every second the man in the cockpit was at the controls. The risk of a catastrophic error increased. He was like a child playing with a loaded gun. Sooner or later, he would pull the trigger. She had to force his hand, but in a controlled way. She needed to create an opportunity, not just wait for one to appear. Her eyes scanned the cabin again, this time not for threats, but for tools. For variables she could manipulate. She saw the fear in people's eyes, the way a mother clutched her child, the way a businessman stared blankly at his shattered laptop on the floor. Fear was a powerful force, but right now it was a liability. It was chaotic and unpredictable. She needed order. She needed a specific, focused event that would draw the hijacker's attention away from her and the cockpit door, even if only for a few precious seconds. Her gaze fell upon an elderly man a few rows ahead. He was clutching his arm, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He wasn't faking it. The stress of the situation was clearly taking a real physical toll on him. And in that moment, an idea, born of desperation and a lifetime of problem-solving, began to form. It was a terrible gamble, but it was the only play she had. She needed an accomplice, or at least an unwitting partner. Her eyes found the flight attendant, the one with the kind face who had moved down the aisle just moments before. The woman was now kneeling by a terrified teenager, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice. The woman in 23A caught her eye. The flight attendant looked up, and their gazes locked. This was the critical moment. There was no time for words, no way to explain the complex, insane idea that was taking shape in her mind. It all had to be done with looks, with the subtle language of the eyes and hands. The woman gave a slow, deliberate glance towards the elderly man clutching his chest. Then she brought her own hand to her chest, mimicking a clutching motion, her face a mask of simulated pain. She held the flight attendant's gaze, willing her to understand. Then she looked pointedly at the taller hijacker who was standing guard near the front, and then back at the flight attendant. The message was a chain of logic, him a medical problem. A distraction. Now, for a heart-stopping second, the flight attendant just stared, her brow furrowed in confusion. The woman's heart sank. Had she been too subtle? Was the request too insane to comprehend? But then, a flicker of understanding dawned in the flight attendant's eyes. It was a risky, dangerous plan, but she was a professional trained to handle emergencies. This was the ultimate emergency. She gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. It was a pact sealed in silence across a cabin full of fear. The flight attendant took a deep breath, her professional mask sliding back into place. She stood up, and with a calm that was nothing short of heroic, she began to walk purposefully toward the elderly man. As she reached his row, she let her voice rise, just enough to cut through the tense silence. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, her voice laced with a perfect blend of concern and authority. The man just moaned, his eyes closed. The flight attendant knelt beside him, her voice growing louder, more urgent. "I have a passenger having a possible heart attack. I need to get to the medical kit now." It worked. The diversion was exactly what was needed. The tall hijacker, who had been pacing like a caged animal, stopped dead in his tracks. His head snapped toward the commotion. The shorter, wiry one, who had been shouting at passengers, also turned his attention to the unfolding drama. They were confused. This wasn't defiance. This was a medical crisis. It was a problem they didn't know how to handle. Their nobody move rule was being broken, but for a reason they couldn't just shoot at. The tall hijacker took a step toward the flight attendant. "Stay where you are." He barked, but his voice was uncertain. He was looking at the sick man, then at the flight attendant, then at the cockpit door, as if torn between his orders and the chaos in front of him. It was the opening. It was only 2, maybe 3 seconds, but in the compressed reality of the cabin, it was an eternity. The woman in 23A moved. She didn't stand up and run. She flowed out of her seat, staying low, using the seats in front of her as cover. Her movements were fluid, economical, a product of countless hours of training. She was a blur of motion against the backdrop of frozen passengers. Her target was the shorter hijacker, the one who was now completely focused on the medical emergency. He was the one standing closest to the pilots, the one who posed the most immediate threat to them. As she closed the distance, she could see the back of his neck, the tense muscles, the sweat staining the collar of his shirt. She didn't think about what she was doing. She just did it. Her body knew the moves. She struck him hard and fast on the side of his neck with the edge of her hand, a precise, disabling blow that she had practiced thousands of times in a different life. There was no loud sound, just a soft, sickening thud. The man's eyes widened in surprise, then rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the floor without a word, his weapon clattering out of his limp hand and sliding under a seat. The whole thing was silent, efficient, and over in a second. The other passengers, stunned by the medical drama, hadn't even seen it happen. The woman didn't pause to admire her work. Her eyes were already scanning for the next objective. She saw the heavy metal fire extinguisher mounted on the wall bracket near the galley. It was a tool, a weapon, a symbol of her new role in this conflict. She grabbed it, the cold, heavy weight of it a strange comfort in her hands. She had a weapon, she had the element of surprise, and she had a clear path to the front of the plane. The game had changed. She was no longer just a passenger. She was a player. The metallic clatter of the weapon sliding under the seat was the loudest sound in the world. It was a sharp, ugly noise that cut through the manufactured calm of the medical diversion. For a fraction of a second, no one reacted. The flight attendant was still focused on the elderly man. The passengers were still watching her, and the tall hijacker was still trying to process the situation. But the woman in the aisle, the one now holding the cold, heavy fire extinguisher, knew that sound was the starting pistol. The silence was over. The tall hijacker's head snapped around, his eyes wide as he saw his partner lying motionless on the floor. The confusion on his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He let out a guttural roar, a sound of fury and fear, and charged. He was a big man, and his charge was like a bull, all momentum and no finesse. He didn't have a plan. He only had an instinct to destroy the thing that had hurt his friend. He swung his weapon, a heavy, blunt object wrapped in cloth, in a wide, clumsy arc that would have crushed her skull if it had connected, but the woman was already moving. Her mind was a calm, clear space amidst the chaos. She saw the swing coming a mile away. Her training, the muscle memory buried deep within her, took over completely. She didn't back away. She stepped in. She brought the fire extinguisher up, using it as a shield. The metal canister met the hijacker's weapon with a loud, echoing clang that vibrated up her arms. The impact was jarring, but she absorbed it, using his own force against him. She sidestepped, letting his momentum carry him past her like a matador letting a bull rush by. He stumbled, off balance, and tried to recover, swinging again wildly. This time she was ready. As he lunged forward to regain his footing, she drove the bottom of the fire extinguisher hard into his stomach. It was not a fancy martial arts move. It was a simple, brutal, and effective application of force. The air whooshed out of his lungs in a painful gasp. He doubled over, his weapon falling from his grasp. He was down, but not out. He was on his knees, gagging and trying to breathe, his eyes still burning with hatred. She could have hit him again, could have ended it, but her focus was elsewhere. Her eyes were locked on the cockpit door. During the struggle, she had lost sight of the third hijacker. A new wave of cold fear washed over her as she saw the cockpit door was swinging shut. The third man, the leader, was inside. He was alone with the controls of a multi-million-dollar aircraft, and he had no idea what he was doing. She didn't hesitate. She left the gasping hijacker on the floor and lunged for the door, her legs pumping, the heavy extinguisher still in her hand. She was too late. She saw the door closing, the heavy, soundproofed barrier about to seal her off from the most critical part of the plane. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, she threw her entire body forward, slamming her shoulder against the door just before it latched. The impact was painful, a sharp, jarring shock that ran through her entire body, but it worked. The door flew back open, and she stumbled into the small, confined space of the flight deck. The scene inside was a nightmare. The plane was in a steep, terrifying dive. The horizon, which should have been level outside the windshield, was now a vertical line of blue sky and green earth. Alarms were blaring, a cacophony of loud, insistent whoops and chimes that screamed of impending disaster. "Terrain! Terrain! Pull up!" a synthesized voice commanded, calm and robotic in its urgency. The third hijacker was in the captain's seat, his hands frantically pawing at the controls, pushing buttons and pulling levers at random. He was trying to make the plane do something, but he was only making it worse. Every time he touched the yoke, the plane shuddered and groaned in protest. He spun around when she burst in, his eyes wild with a mixture of panic and fury. He saw her, and for a moment he seemed to forget the plane was plummeting towards the ground. He saw an enemy, a threat to his control. He raised his weapon, a small, dark pistol, his hands shaking badly. "Get out!" he screamed, his voice lost in the din of the alarms. But she didn't see a terrorist with a gun. In that moment, filtered through the lens of her pilot's mind, he was just a system error. A dangerous, unpredictable variable that was causing the aircraft to fail. Her focus narrowed to a single point, neutralized the threat. She didn't back away. She moved forward, closing the distance between them in the cramped cockpit. He was a desperate man, and his desperation made him predictable. He pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the small space, a sharp crack that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the wind and the screaming alarms. The bullet missed her, shattering the thick plexiglass of the side window, creating a spiderweb of cracks and a sudden, terrifying whoosh of air. She didn't flinch. She kicked out, her foot connecting with his wrist. There was a sharp crack of bone, and he cried out, the pistol flying from his grasp and clattering onto the instrument panel. In the same fluid motion. She shoved him hard, using her body weight to pin him against the console. His head hit the ceiling with a dull thud. He was dazed, disoriented. She delivered a single, sharp, precise blow to the side of his head, a calculated move designed to incapacitate, not to kill. His eyes went blank and he slumped down in the seat, unconscious. The plane was still diving. The alarms were still screaming. She didn't waste a second. She shoved the unconscious man out of the captain's seat, his limp body falling to the floor. She slid into the seat, her hands instantly finding the yoke. The leather was cold and familiar under her palms. The plane was fighting her, pulling down, wanting to fly itself into the ground. She could feel the immense G-forces pushing her down into the seat. She ignored them. Her eyes scanned the instruments, her mind processing the flood of information in an instant. Airspeed, altitude, rate of descent. It was all bad. But it was not yet hopeless. She pulled back on the yoke with a steady, firm pressure, her muscles straining against the force of the dive. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose of the massive plane began to rise. The screaming of the alarms began to soften. The horizon, which had been a terrifying vertical line, began to level out. "I have control," she said, her voice a firm, quiet whisper, a promise to herself and to the 200 souls behind her. "I have control." The plane was level now, but the peace was a fragile, temporary thing. The alarms had stopped their screaming, replaced by the low, urgent chatter of the wind whistling through the spider-webbed crack in the side window. The air was thin and cold, carrying the sharp, acrid smell of the gunshot that still hung in the confined space of the cockpit. Her hands were steady on the yoke, but a fine tremor had started in her legs, a delayed reaction to the adrenaline that had been flooding her system. She was in control of the aircraft, but she was not in control of herself. Not yet. Her first instinct, the one drilled into her over 1,000 hours of flight time, was to assess the machine. She ran her eyes over the instrument panel, a chaotic symphony of lights and dials. The autopilot was disengaged, the plane in a state of manual flight she had forced upon it. The altitude was alarmingly low, the airspeed too high for their current situation. They had lost thousands of feet in the dive. She needed to climb, to get to a safer altitude where the air was thicker and the options were more plentiful. She gently pushed the throttles forward, feeling the deep, powerful roar of the engines respond. The plane began to ascend, a slow, steady climb away from the unforgiving ground that had been rushing up to meet them, but she couldn't just fly. She was alone in the front of a 200-ton aircraft with 200 terrified souls behind her and 3 unconscious, dangerous men on board. She needed help. She needed to talk to someone. Her hand found the microphone switch, her fingers fumbling for a moment before she found the right button. She pressed it. Her voice, when it came, was surprisingly steady, a product of a lifetime of speaking into these headsets in moments of crisis. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," she said, the words a ritual, a formal declaration of emergency. "This is Flight 247. The flight crew has been incapacitated. This is a former flight deck officer. I have control of the aircraft." She paused, taking a breath. "We have 3 hostiles on board, all neutralized. We have a window breach in the cockpit. We require immediate assistance and landing priority." On the ground, thousands of miles away, a stunned silence greeted her transmission. An air traffic controller in a darkened room stared at his screen, then at his colleague. The voice was female, calm, and professional, but the words were unbelievable. "Flight 247, say again your situation?" The controller asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "You say you have control?" "I have control," she repeated, her voice firm. "The aircraft is stable. I am a former military pilot. I need vectors to the nearest suitable airfield." Her old identity, the one she had packed away years ago, was now her most valuable asset. It was a key that unlocked a world of trust and cooperation in an instant. The controller's voice changed, the disbelief replaced by a brisk, efficient urgency. He began to rattle off headings and altitudes, guiding her toward a military base in Germany that had a long runway and was equipped for emergencies. As she followed his instructions, her mind turned to the cabin. They were still in the dark, both literally and figuratively. They knew the hijackers had been fought, but they didn't know the outcome. They could feel the plane climbing, but they didn't know who was flying it. The fear would be building again, a monster with 1,000 heads. She needed to be their voice, their calm in the storm. She switched the microphone from the air traffic control frequency to the public address system. She took another deep breath, this one harder than the last. "What do you say to 200 people you've just saved from certain death?" "This is the pilot speaking," she said, and the irony of the statement was not lost on her. Her voice, amplified through the cabin, was a balm on the raw nerves of the passengers. "The situation is under control? The aircraft is secure. The crew and I are working to get you on the ground as safely and as quickly as possible. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. We will be landing shortly." It was simple, direct, and it left out the terrifying details. It was everything they needed to hear. A wave of relief, so powerful it was almost a physical force, swept through the cabin. A few people began to cry, but this time they were tears of relief. The flight attendant, the one with the kind face, looked toward the cockpit door, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and gratitude. She couldn't do this alone. She needed the crew. "I need the senior cabin crew member to come to the flight deck," she said over the intercom, her voice now a command. A moment later, there was a tentative knock on the door. She had left it unlatched. The flight attendant peeked in, her eyes widening at the scene, the unconscious hijacker on the floor, the shattered window, and this woman, the stranger, calmly flying the massive plane. "Secure the other 2, the woman in the pilot's seat said, her voice all business. "Use restraints. Check on our original pilots. Do what you can for them. Keep everyone calm. Can you do that?" The flight attendant, a professional to her core, simply nodded, her face a mask of determination. "Yes, Captain," she said, the title a form of respect. A transfer of authority that felt both surreal and absolutely right. The next hour was the longest of her life. She flew the plane, guided by the calm, reassuring voices of the air traffic controllers. The flight attendant organized the cabin, enlisting the help of a few able-bodied passengers to secure the hijackers with plastic zip ties from an emergency kit. She checked on the original pilots, who were bruised and shaken but otherwise unharmed. The cabin, once a place of terror, had become a small, temporary community, bound together by a shared experience and a quiet, fierce will to live. As the coast of Europe appeared on the horizon, a thin, dark line against the darkening ocean, the weight of what she had done began to press down on her. The adrenaline had completely worn off, leaving a profound exhaustion in its wake. Her arms ached, her back was stiff, and her eyes burned from staring at the instruments. She thought about the life she had left behind, the reasons she had walked away from this world of pressure and responsibility. She had wanted something normal, something safe. And yet, when the ultimate test had come, she had not hesitated. She had not forgotten. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, a mix of pride and a deep, aching sadness for the person she used to be. The landing was the final challenge. The controllers talked her down every step of the way, their voices her lifeline. "Gear down," they said, and she moved the lever, feeling the thud of the landing gear locking into place. Flaps full, and she pulled the switch, feeling the plane slow, its nose wanting to dip. The runway lights were ahead of her, two bright rows of hope in the darkness. She focused on them, letting everything else fall away. The world shrank to the small window in front of her, the yoke in her hands and the voice in her head. Just like the old days. The plane touched down with a firm bump, not a graceful landing, but a safe one. The roar of the reverse thrusters filled the air as she brought the plane to a stop on the long, empty runway. When it was finally still, she cut the engines, and the silence that fell was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She leaned back in the seat, her hands finally leaving the controls. And for the first time in hours, she let herself shake when the cabin door opened. To the sight of flashing lights and emergency vehicles, there was no cheering, no applause. There was only a profound, collective silence. As she walked out of the cockpit and down the aisle, passengers reached out, their hands gently touching her arm, her shoulder. They didn't say anything. They didn't have to. Their eyes said it all. She just nodded, her throat too tight to speak, her own eyes blurred with tears. She walked down the stairs and onto the cool tarmac, away from the plane and the people, a solitary figure against the flashing red and blue lights. She wasn't a hero looking for praise. She was just a pilot who had seen a plane in trouble and did what she was trained to do. And now, all she wanted was to go home.